we will get started tonight, and we are going to go back to what we were talking about a couple weeks ago, because there was something that I said a couple weeks ago that I said, we're going to put a pin in this and come back to it. I didn't think it was going to be a couple weeks until we got back to it, but now we're coming back to it. Okay, so if you remember a couple weeks ago, we talked about some of the earliest translations, and there was a lot of different ones, but specifically we looked at the Septuagint, we looked at the Vulgate, and then we looked a little bit about John Wycliffe and some of his translation that he did in the 1300s. Okay, now going back to the Septuagint, one thing that kind of got started with Septuagint was the Apocrypha, and I mentioned that, I believe, in the couple of Bible studies ago. And I said we're going to put a pin in it because I had intended that when we came around to the Vulgate, I was going to talk about it some more. Now, just kind of refresh your memory, the Apocrypha is several books that the Jews never canonized. They did not consider it to be scripture, but these books were coming around after the Old Testament was completed, and they're, you know, they're good books. They're good books as far as literature goes, as far as history goes, in history of the Jews. And so a lot of the Jews liked these books of the Apocrypha, and they kind of found its way into the Septuagint, not meaning to be on equal par with Scripture, but they viewed it to be something that would be good for education and mutual benefit, and so a lot of times they included those on there, okay? So when Christians started to take the Apocrypha and use that as their Old Testament scriptures, many of them began to say, when they took the Septuagint and used that to be their Old Testament scriptures, had the Apocrypha there, and so a lot of them started to become attached to the Apocrypha. Now, if you recall, we were talking about this man Jerome in the 4th century, 5th century, who started to translate the New Testament Greek scriptures into Latin, and then he, after he got that project going, because he wasn't the only one involved in it, he then went down to Jerusalem and started to talk with the Jewish people about how to translate Hebrew and Hebrew scriptures, because he wanted to translate the Old Testament from the Hebrew. He didn't want to translate it from the Latin. He wanted to go back to the Hebrew. And so, to the New Testament or Septuagint Greek, he wanted to go back to the Hebrew. So while he was there, he noticed that they did not include it in their canon, and so he did not want the Vulgate Old Testament to include the Apocrypha. But again, you know, this was not something that was his project solely alone. It was other people as well. And so even though he opposed it, there's other people that was also working on it. The Vulgate was concluded after his death, and so the Apocrypha found its way into the Vulgate, and therefore that went into scriptures. Now, I don't recall if Wycliffe actually translated the Apocrypha or not, because he was using the Latin Vulgate to translate his translation. But if you recall, Wycliffe was died, but then he was denounced as a heretic, and so his work kind of went underground for centuries in England. And so now tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to come up to the time period of the 1500s and take a look at the translation that occurred during that time period. And actually, this was just kind of a blossoming of translation, because it also coincided with the Protestant Reformation as well. Okay? Now, to understand this time period, we really need to, or understand the translation of this time period, we have to understand the politics of that time period as well. All right? So before the 1500s, before 1517, you had the Catholic Church, And you also had the state, that is, the kings. And so here you have the church, and you also have the kings of the Roman Catholic Church in all the countries that would have comprised. And there was always kind of a little bit of a conflict all the way through the Middle Ages as far as who had the power, okay? So kings would say, we're kings, we have the power, but at the same time, the Catholic Church and the Pope would say, well, we have our power, which is from God. And so there's oftentimes this little power struggle that happened back and forth down throughout the years, with more often than not, the Pope and the Church gaining the upper hand over the kings, because if the kings started to get too far out of line, all the Pope had to do is say, I'm going to excommunicate you, which meant is you're not getting into heaven if we do this. And so that pretty much kind of brought people back in line. However, when we start to come into the 1500s with the Protestant Reformation, all of a sudden that little bit of a trump card that the Pope and the Church had over kings, all of a sudden that was no more. And so now what we see is that we had kings that were in control, but at the same time, they were using the church, whatever denomination it was, kind of in their advantage, because most people felt like that between the church and the state, there was no separation. It was all one and the same. And so here in the United States, where we get our expression separation of church and state, the reason why we have this expression separation of church and state is meaning that the state does not and should not have any sway over what people's religious beliefs should be. There is a separation where the state is going to be the state, but people's religious beliefs are going to be their religious beliefs. In the 1500s, it was not that way. As a matter of fact, what you had was usually the ruling king or the ruling authority would say, this is my church. This is what I'm doing. And so therefore, if you don't align with that, then you are therefore not aligning with me. If you're not aligning with me, then you are doing sedition. And with that, we're going to persecute you. And so throughout the 1500s, you'd have a lot of very bloody civil wars that were occurring because of one ruler would come to the throne, he'd be a Catholic or she'd be a Catholic, and then all of a sudden the Protestants would be persecuted. But then a Protestant ruler would come to the throne, and it would be vice versa. Okay? And so this was occurring within this time period, the 1500s, 16th century. Okay? And this is something that we've got to understand, is that as we are looking at translation, this is the backdrop of what was happening. One thing that we find quite frequently during this time period is the divine right of kings. Have you ever heard of the divine right of kings? It is a religious belief that God has established the king on the throne, and since God has established the king, then the king or the monarch, because in some cases it was the queen, that God, since he had established the monarchy, people did not have any right to tell the monarchy what to do, because the monarchy was solely responsible and solely answerable to God. Now, at the same time, even though you had this divine right of kings, you need to understand that the church, as far as the clergy goes, oftentimes when you would have the king that was ruling, then whatever denomination that he would be in charge of, that clergy would also carry significant weight and significant power as well. Okay? All right. So, you understand the backdrop of what's going on during this time period? Okay. So, here we come down to this man that we're going to talk about first, William Tyndale. Anybody ever heard of Tyndale? Okay, you may have heard of Tyndale because there's a publishing company. Not only is there a publishing company about Wycliffe, but there's also a publishing company about Tyndale. And so Tyndale, William Tyndale, not really much is known about his early beginnings. And by the way, we're talking, our focus is on England here. And so, there's other things that were going on in the continent, Germany, France, so on and so forth. But for our discussion, this is solely in England. And so all these people that we're going to talk about tonight are English people. Okay, so William Tyndale grew up, not as really known much about his background. He started to go to university, graduated from Oxford, started to teach, and was very influential at Oxford. As he was there, he started to become versed in biblical languages, especially in Greek, and he became very fluent in Greek translation. And so as he was doing this, he set out to start to translate the Bible from Greek into English, or translate from Latin into English. Now, all of this was occurring in England, and he felt like, this was something that would be good and fine with the king. However, the king really didn't agree with a lot of his translations, and so because of that, Tyndale got in trouble and fled from England to the continent. Some people say it was in Hamburg, or he is in Wittenberg. If you have ever heard of Wittenberg, do you know what famous thing was posted on the gates of Wittenberg Castle about this time period? As a matter of fact, in 1517. Starts with 95 theses from Luther, okay? And so that is kind of the birth date of the Protestant Reformation. And so here is Tyndale coming over not too much longer after that, and he starts to become acquainted with Martin Luther, at least what Martin Luther's doing. He is also becoming acquainted with Erasmus's Greek text. You remember that several weeks ago we talked about how Erasmus was a Catholic scholar, theologian that developed a Greek text about the time of the Protestant Reformation, even though he was not a reformer, and he was also right about the time of the printing press. And oh, by the way, Gutenberg's Bible was a printing in the Vulgate. I looked that up. And so getting back to Tyndale, so here he's got Erasmus's Greek text, and here he is away from England, and he has got this burning desire to translate. And so in 1525, he begins to work on his translation of the Bible. And so as he's working on it, as he is translating, he's just kind of releasing and publishing little bits and pieces of it. Tyndale got finished with the New Testament. He finished with a lot of the Old Testament, going back to the Hebrew instead of to the Vulgate, even though he did kind of look at the Vulgate occasionally to kind of see what was going on. But this was the first time that we're going to have a translation into English, at least a main translation into English from Greek and Hebrew. Because before that, with Wycliffe, if you recall, it was from the Vulgate, right? And so instead of going from Greek to Latin to English, it's just Greek to English. Instead of Hebrew to Latin to English, it's just Hebrew to English, okay? And so as he did this, his translation began to rile a bunch of feathers. And one of the main reasons why his translation started to rile a bunch of feathers is because he was actually trying to translate things without the bias of the main theological discussions of the day. And so instead of using the word church, which was the main word at that time, he used the word congregation. Okay? Instead of using the word priest, he used the word elder. Instead of using do penance, he used the word repentance. Okay? Big deal? It wasn't that day and time, because when you understand what was going on in that day and time, you start to see that all of these different thoughts were really shots across the bow of the powers that be. Okay? So instead of the church, and here you got the Catholic Church, or you got the Episcopal Church, or you got the Lutheran Church, instead of these big denominational powerhouses, he's just simply translating for what it is, which is just simply a congregation. And so that is eliminating the power of all of those denominations, because no longer can they say, hey, we are the Catholic Church, this is our structure, this is our hierarchy, this is why we have all of this power and influence that's occurring. Then all of a sudden it's like, no, wait a minute, we just have these congregations and these local congregations. In the same way with priest, instead of translating as priest, which is going to be a go-between between God and man, if you're translating it as far as elder goes, then all of a sudden it's somebody who's just a respected person. Instead of due penance, if you're saying repentance, as far as to make a change in your life between good and evil, between God and yourself, if you change due penance, which is I've sinned and so therefore I've got to do something to make up for the sin, if you change that over to repentance, then all of a sudden it's, well, I don't have to do anything to make up for the sin. I just have to confess my sin and change my heart and change what's going on between me and the Lord. Okay? And so these little bitty things that we may not think as being a big deal, do you see how this was a huge deal back in that day and time? Now, the reason why Tyndale was getting in hot water in England and had to leave England was because of these things. And as he began to translate the Bible and use these things, the temperature continued to be hot. And it was hot from King Henry VII, who was King of England at the time, because he did not at all like what Tyndale was doing. And so Henry, and by the way, we're talking about this church and state and how the Protestant Reformation broke down this little bit of church power, king power, and the battle that was going on between them. See, that kind of happened with King Henry in 1500s. King Henry wanted to have a male heir to the throne, and you remember the story. His wife wasn't given a male child, and so therefore he wanted to divorce her or get an annulment from her through the Catholic Church, and then marry somebody else. Well, the Pope at that time said, no, you're not getting an annulment. And because of that, King Henry decided, hey, you know what? I don't need the Pope and I don't need the Catholic Church. I can just create my own church. And that's exactly what he did. And guess who he set up to be the head of it? Himself. Because he had the divine right of kings, and God had appointed him to that position, and so therefore what he said goes. So you can see that this is what's making him so very upset behind all of that. So, fast forward a couple years, we see that William was convicted in absentia because he was over in the continent. But there was somebody who was close to Tyndale who turned on him, turned him in, and from that he was imprisoned. From that he was executed. He was strangled, and then he was burned after he had passed away at the stake. And one of his last dying breath was, "Lord, open the eyes of the king." Okay? So Tyndale and the work that he did wasn't really complete. He had a little bit of the Old Testament to go, and he had some other people that worked with him. One was Miles Coverdale. And so Miles Coverdale continued Tyndale's work and finished it, and then also went and kind of made a translation a little bit of himself. By the way, as far as, we talk about these translations as far as Tyndale, Coverdale, these names and everything were kind of given later on, and they usually were just simply, the work of Tyndale, the work of Coverdale, even though there was more people like Coverdale helped with Tyndale's translation. But Coverdale in 1535 went and kind of did something a little bit novel. He just simply dedicated his translation, even though it was largely Tyndale's translation, and the king really didn't like Tyndale, but he went and said, "This is my translation, and I dedicate it to you, king." And so from that, king said, "Hey, that's great. Let's have it." And so from there, Tyndale's translation pretty much started to make its way into England quite readily from that. Now, in addition to Tyndale or Coverdale, there was also a man whose name was Thomas Matthews. Many historians don't believe that Thomas Matthews was really his name. They really think that it was John Thomas, I believe is who it was. But anyway, John Thomas was an associate of Tyndale. We think that he was going by Matthews as kind of a pseudonym to kind of keep himself out of hot water, or at least to, kind of deflect things. But what he did was he took some unpublished works of the New Testament or the Old Testament from Tyndale, and then kind of took those and put it with other things. And so, there is this Bible out there called the Matthews, or was this Bible out there called the Matthews. But keep in mind, the Coverdale, the Tyndale, and the Matthews, they were all very, very, very similar to one another, okay? Now, as time progressed, then there became another Bible that was done, and this Bible was called the Great Bible. Anybody know why it was called the Great Bible? Keep in mind, this wasn't just simply somebody saying, "Hey, let's make a Bible translation. Let's just call it the Great Bible because it's going to be a great Bible." People called it that way because of its size. It was huge. It was an enormous Bible that was printed. And the reason why it was done that way is because this was going to be the Bible that was used in churches, Episcopal churches, during that time period. And so they were big Bibles, they were expensive Bibles. Oftentimes they would have been chained to the pulpits there in the Episcopal churches so that people wouldn't steal them. But this was going and supposed to have been the established Bible of the Episcopal Church. Miles Coverdale was tapped to kind of lead this project, and so you can kind of see that the Great Bible was, again, based on Miles Coverdale's work, and Miles Coverdale based his work on Tyndale, and so you can kind of see that it's just, a little transfer here of what was going on. The Great Bible was, like I said, it was great big, it was expensive, it was not meant for the common everyday man. And so because of that, what we see is that there was another group of people in Geneva that created another Bible. Now, you've got Henry. And when Henry died, Mary took the throne. And anybody ever hear of Bloody Mary? Okay, Queen Mary, this is the Bloody Mary. Henry established his own church, the Episcopal Church of England, and then Mary, who was a Catholic, said, "No, we're not going to have the Episcopal Church of England. We are going to be Catholic." And so for many years in England, the Catholics persecuted the Episcopalians and anybody else because there was a large number of other groups in England at that time, including Baptists. And so from all that persecution, that's how she got the nickname Bloody Mary, from all of the persecutions. Now, one group that she persecuted were people who were Calvinists, and as she persecuted them, just like William Tyndale, these Calvinists fled to the continent, to Geneva, and as they were there, they started coming into contact with other people, John Calvin, and they started to decide, you know what, we're going to create our own translation in English. And so they worked on translating their own Bible in English. And who do you think that they drew from primarily? Tyndale. And so the Geneva Bible, and the reason why it was called that is because it was developed in Geneva. The Geneva Bible was going to be different from the Great Bible because instead of having a great, big, expensive Bible to be used in churches, the Geneva Bible was going to be small. And it was going to be inexpensive, relatively speaking, and it was going to be for people. And so this is going to be somebody's household Bible that they're going to read to their families and that they're going to use for their own personal use. And they can afford it because it's cheap and it's compact, and so they can publish it around. Because of that, the Geneva became very popular. I mean, most people in the latter part of the 1500s used the Geneva Bible, and they were acquainted with the Geneva Bible. They loved the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible took on a lot of the same characteristics of these right here. And so they again talked about congregation, they talked about elder, they talked about repentance. They did some other things too. What they did was they, in the margins, they started to make notes. I guess you could say this was kind of like, a first study Bible, so to speak. And so in those marginal notes, many times what they started to do was write things out that may have been true to the Bible, but at the same time, it was not true to this idea about the divine right of kings and to the hierarchy of the church, whatever the church was. And so from that, people became very upset with the Geneva Bible. However, you've got the Geneva Bible there, and the populace loved it. It's not as if that the Geneva Bible was downright out saying and denying the fact of the divine right of kings and of the hierarchy of the clergy and everything like that. But there was a lot of times it was implied in the notes. And so with that, like I said, it made a whole lot of people upset. And so with the Great Bible and with Mary's passing and with Elizabeth on the throne, what was decided is we're going to have an official Bible, okay? This is going to be the Bible that is going to be used in the churches throughout England. And anybody know what the name of it is? No. It was the Bishop's Bible, okay? And so the Bishop's Bible was, that's the reason. It actually went by another name of Whitchurch, but it also it's mainly known by this name Bishop's Bible. The Bishop's Bible was, again, based on the Great Bible. It was based on Coverdale's. It was based on Tyndale. But it would be something that would have been more applicable for Episcopal churches. It would have been more palatable for the political dealings of the day. However, now you've got kind of a little bit of controversy between these two. The Bishop's Bible, that's the Bible that, the clergy and the powers that be would want everybody to read and learn and understand. The Geneva was right there near and dear in people's hearts, and, they didn't want to give it up. And so it's kind of like, okay, what are we going to do about it? All right? Okay, so we pass from that time, after the death of Elizabeth, then we see that James I succeeded her on the throne. Now, James was king of Scotland at the time, but then when Elizabeth died, she didn't have an heir, and so he was next in line. So he became king of Scotland, England, and Ireland. And so it was like a united monarchy that was there. And James came into a time period in England where there was a lot of political unrest and political turmoil that was going on. I mean, you had this back and forth between Henry, Episcopal, Mary, Catholic, Elizabeth, Episcopal. And so it was kind of like, okay, now what is King James going to do? Number one. Number two is that the Church of England, the Episcopalians, started to split a little bit. And so you had the mainline Episcopalians, but then you also had the Puritans. You guys hear of the Puritans before? Right. So the Puritans were wanting to purify the Church of England. They were wanting to purify them doctrinally. They were wanting to purify them morally. They were wanting to purify them as far as the abuses that were occurring of the day. And so the Puritans were kind of, a little bit of a, I won't say a force against King James, but it was going to be a little bit of a struggle with these, and you don't want things to break out into civil war, especially civil war between the Puritans and the Episcopalians, because you've already got enough trouble between the Episcopalians and the Catholics, not to mention things that are simmering underneath with everybody else as well. And so the Puritans came to King James, called the Millenary Petition, and they wanted to petition King James to do certain things as he is now taking the throne from Scotland into England. King James was really not all that fond of the Puritans. While he was king of Scotland, he kind of had to deal with some of the Puritans there, and he considered them to be pests. He considered them to be radical extremists. And but now all of a sudden, when he became king of England, he was kind of like, well, I really didn't mean you guys. I meant the other guys. But they presented this millenary petition before the king. And so what he did was he invited several of the Episcopalian ministers, teachers that would have been Oxford and Puritan people that would have been leaders within those circles. Keep in mind, it's all Church of England, okay? Don't make the mistake of saying, okay, well, here is, this group pit against this group. They're all the same group. It's just competing thoughts within this one group. So he invited them all in 1604 to Hampton Court to have this conference, the Hampton Court Conference, to where he was going to address these petitions. He had intended to do it back in 1603, but there was an outbreak of the plague, and so they decided, well, maybe this isn't such a good thing to do. Let's all, what do we do during COVID? Let's all quarantine. Did we quarantine? Was that what it's called? Okay. Yeah, okay. So anyway, let's all stay home. And then when things kind of died down, then they all met back together. Now, the petitions that the Puritans came and presented to the king, hoping that, they were really going to get a little bit of traction with their, with what they had going on. The king rejected all of them. So it was, a lost cause with all of that. However, there was a man named John Reynolds, or it may be spelled John Reynolds if you look it up. But he was a teacher of Oxford. He was a well-respected scholar. He was also Puritan. And so he was there in the conference, and he put forth an idea. And the idea was, let's embark on a whole new translation. And the reasoning for it, and the reason why King James did it, is because he wanted to unify everybody. What they felt like is, if the Geneva would have continued, the Geneva Bible would have continued, then all of a sudden you got these ideas about the divine right of kings, about the hierarchy of the clergy, of everything like that. They felt like that was going to continue. And so they felt like, okay, if we have a new translation, a better translation, Because after all, you're talking about people who are doing this, translating largely on very small groups. And by the way, Tyndale, excellent Bible translator, Coverdale, Matthews, so on and so forth. But they felt like, hey, let's pool quite a bit of the best minds of Britain together, best minds of the Episcopal Church together, the Church of England, together to do this. And so they embarked on having 50-something translators, even though 47 of them actually worked on it. They were going to be paired up to where there was going to be a group that was going to be working on one thing at Oxford, another one at Cambridge, another one somewhere else. And they were all going to be working on these projects of the Bible simultaneously. And so they had different things. And John Reynolds was one of the ones that was heading all this up. And then when they would finish with their portion of the Bible, then they would send it to another group for editing and review. And at the same time, after all that was done, then they were going to call people in the Church of England together and have them review it as well. So the intent was to have this unified Bible, unified translation that would be a very solid biblical translation that would be there, but at the same time take care of all of these things down here. And so we don't have to worry about any of those anymore, okay? So as far as the instructions go, King James laid down some instructions for the translators. And one of the instructions that they were supposed to do is that they were supposed to use the old ecclesiastical words. And so specifically what was mentioned is church. You had to use the word church. You could not translate something as congregation, even though that would be the natural definition of the word ecclesia that we've talked about before. And so if you're wondering, if you take a look at the King James translation, you come across Acts 17:39, and you see about how there was this church of God in the wilderness, talking about the Old Testament Israelites, and you start to think about it, why in the world would they translate church? Because the church didn't start until Jesus. So what is the church doing in the wilderness before that? Well, it's because of that instruction. I mean, now they did translate ecclesia as far as an assembly in Acts chapter 19, because that was a pagan assembly. That was in Ephesus, where it was a real secular use of the word ecclesia, where people of the town of Ephesus were coming together to conduct business. However, because it was a riotous mob that was hauling Paul and others before it, then it was an unlawful assembly. And so they translated that correctly. But if anything had a religious connotation to it, because they don't want to make the king upset, they translated it as church. And so therefore, that's how you got that word church. Okay, so that was one of the instructions. Another instruction was that if there was any kind of disagreement with any sort of wordage, any sort of translation, as far as, well, it could be this or it could be that, they had to defer to the old divine traditions and elders of the day. In other words, you had to go back to the roots of the Church of England, to Catholic Church, to things like that. You couldn't just simply go and say, hey, wait a minute, let's look at this from a fresh perspective. You had to go back and default to that position right there. Another provision that was in these instructions was that they were supposed to use the bishop's Bible as a base of translation and use the bishop's Bible translation unless they found a better translation of the Greek and Hebrew. And so 86% of the King James translation is actually the bishop's Bible that they just simply took. They looked at the Greek, they looked at the Hebrew, and they said, you know what, this is a good translation. We need to keep it. When there's times that they would look at the bishop's Bible and they say, you know what, a better way to translate this would be, then they would also change as well. Now, another stipulation involved in the instructions to the translators was that they were also to go and look at some of these other Bibles. And so here we've got, the Great Bible, we've got the Coverdale, we've got the Tyndale, Matthews, and the Geneva. They were actually supposed to use these Bibles. And so, they were supposed to refer to the bishop's Bible because that was what their base was. But they were also supposed to go back and take a look at the Great Bible, or the Whit Church's Bible. Take a look at Coverdale. Take a look at Tyndale, which is kind of very ironic since, he was executed by the king, not even 100 years before this, and the Matthews Bible, and even the Geneva Bible. They were supposed to look at the Geneva Bible, but there was a pecking order. They started with the bishops, the Great, the Coverdale, Matthews, Tyndale, and the Geneva was something that was supposed to be consulted last of all, but it was consulted. And so from that, they came across with what we have today as the King James. Okay? By the way, it wasn't called the King James originally. That was something that, just like Tyndale, Coverdale, Great Matthews, these were names that were kind of applied to it later. It was just simply the translation that the king authorized. By the way, the first Bible that was authorized by the church and by the king was the bishops. Okay? All right. Comments and questions about that?
Interesting.
I think so.
Didn't know there were so many.
I know. And when you're saying, are you saying 1517 or 70?
1517 was the Protestant Reformation. That's when Luther nailed his thesis to the door. Now, Tyndale started his work in 1525. Coverdale started his work in 1535. Matthews would have been just a little bit later than that, like 1537. The Great Bible, I think, was around 1550s. And the Bishop's Bible, I believe, was in the 1580s. The Geneva Bible would have been translated, I think, in around 1560s.
Anything on 1620 for some reason? What's that number coming?
1620?
Yeah.
We're not there yet.
Oh, okay.
We'll hit that next week.
She's ahead of her time.
She is. Yeah.
Well, and I'm thinking I need to get my Uncle David's family history.
Is he that old?
No, but the reason I'm saying that, my grandpa was John Reynolds.
Really?
Spelled that same way?
Well, I don't know. R-E-Y-N-O-L-D-S.
There is that spelling, and then there's Reynolds. R-A-I-N.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
My uncle, well, was John Dennis Reynolds was my grandpa. John David Reynolds was my uncle.
Okay.
And I know we always call him Uncle David.
Okay.
But he started doing a family history, and I've got a copy of it somewhere, and I'm thinking, okay, now I really got to start digging.
Okay. Well, it'd be interesting if your ancestry went back to John Reynolds. John Reynolds died in 1607. He did not finish the translation of the King James. And so, even though he's the one that kind of got it started.
I was looking up while you were talking, and it says in here too that the King James Version is 83% of Tyndale's words. So I guess when you're showing it Tyndale and Coverdale, whatever,
Yeah.
pretty much he really set a lot of the standard, I guess.
Tyndale had a huge impact in how we got our Bibles today. Because like I said, this was the first mainstream Bible that was translated into English from the Greek and from the Hebrew. And so from that base, everything else went from there. Yeah.